What's going on, everyone? Welcome back. We finally have an episode, and honestly, it's going to be an intro by me and then probably just a lot of my voice overlaying the work we're doing. Why? Because, well, we're flying wide open. We're trying to make it to Buttonwillow. We've got a lot of work ahead of us. So go ahead, sit back, relax, and enjoy this montage of the final assembly. We've got part one. Now, to get started, I obviously have two major welding things I need to do before I can start my final assembly. One, create a bracket for my SmartyCam lens that goes forward. The second one is a lift or tow bar. Now, I know some of you are wondering, why are you putting a lift or tow bar behind your head? This is probably the best place to put it on a Store WF1. And I'm not actually putting the bar, I'm putting a tube that we're going to be able to drill holes for, so that any corner worker or any safety truck official, all they have to do is shove a bar through that opening and it will safely lift or tow my car. Now, to be certain that I'm not going to do any kind of damage to the engine, I decided to pull it out and remove the rear wing just to make my life a little bit easier when it came to walking around the car while I'm welding. So I know I should have probably done this welding prior or earlier in this process, but c'est la vie. At least it's going to be done now, and even though it takes a few extra steps to protect the car from the welding we're doing, it's going to turn out brilliantly. So one of the things we're going to do is we're going to try out one of Radical's spin safe clutches. Now, it sounds a little silly, but if you spin out with a Hayabusa, you're probably going to damage the starter motor and not be able to restart the car. So this kit that's sold by Radical, that's built by Recluse or something like that, is just some variation of a slipper clutch. At low RPMs, the clutch is allowed to slip, but at higher RPMs, it ends up binding up completely. So this should, theoretically, make it safer for me to run with my hand clutch. So as you can see in my right hand, that is the centrifugal clutch portion of this kit. It's the last piece in, and it's gonna go in right on top of the majority of the clutch packs they provided with the kit. Now it's on to the final plate and the springs and the bolts. And don't worry, George, I definitely torqued everything. So up to this point, I had tightened down all of my brake lines, but they haven't actually been tightened all the way. So now we get to enjoy tightening all the brake fittings and making sure the brake lines are clear with compressed air. So for those that know, we know, but for those that don't, working with the pedal assembly is, well, it's just the worst. Fortunately with the Store, there's a lot more access than when you have your full carbon composite tubs, but still, this is just a difficult job to get all the hardware where you need it to be. That was why I did most of the assembly outside of the car, and fortunately, these 4 bolts went in rather easy. Now, I can't begin to tell you how many times since I made this video I have changed the soft lines and how they're laid out. But this gives you a pretty darn good idea as to how complex these systems get and how difficult it can be sometimes to avoid binding. Now, this is what I'll call Rev 1. We're on to Rev 4, and Rev 4 actually has these brake pressure sensors behind the front bulkhead. I'll show you that in my next video, but for now, just enjoy some wonderful assembly. And of course, with assembly, one cannot be done without zip ties. So now that the brake lines have been properly secured and tightened, I'm gonna go ahead and zip tie those in place. Now, while I've got the zip ties out, I might as well do the fire suppression system hose that runs to the back of my car, or at least to the fuel cell and the engine. Now I've got to run it up the side here as well, and now that all the zip ties are in place, we can start trimming. We get to move on to installing the steering rack, and the steering rack, it sounds silly, but you gotta make sure it's centered. This is something I pointed out to my friend Kyle, who almost missed this step putting together his M3 that you've seen in the corner. But fortunately, he caught it, and I got my steering rack in, and it is dead nuts. When I say dead nuts, a 32nd of an inch difference left to right, that's pretty darn good. So the steering rack is now in, the pedal assembly is now in, so it's time for my titanium sheet and the floor of my Store. After a little bit of a wipe down, we're ready to install it for the first time, for the last time. And along with installing this, I'm gonna install those pieces of aluminum that are gonna act as the base plates for my cooling system. Now, I am taking my time with this because even though there are bolt holes, there is a chance that stuff isn't lined up, and I want to make sure I've got the right amount of thread depth in terms of grabbing the fasteners. With the floor on, I get to install the side pods, and with installing the side pods, well, I get to at least properly test fit all of the ductwork we've been working on. Now, I will remind you, we still have trimming to do, and we've left plenty of material to be trimmed off. So basically, these radiator ducts are sitting, I want to say about 6 inches too tall. And that's okay. You can always take carbon fiber off. You can't always replace it. Well, at least not as easily, right? So one of the other things we've got to do is replace all the spherical rod ends. And we don't have to do this, but it is a really wise thing to do. You just never know when one of these has had enough, and if one of these has enough, well, you're gonna go into the wall. So spending money, even though it's a considerable amount of money these days for Aurora rod ends, it's cheap insurance and making sure that the car is gonna behave how you need it to. Now I get to move on to installing one of my tripod axles. The right side was fighting me, but the left side we got to install the cup and the outer cup, but we also had to make sure that the gun barrel aspect of my axle was clean. It's amazing how much debris can be in those axles, and it's always important to clean inside and outside the axle, mainly because, well, the inside portion of the axle is exposed to all of the grease. So even though we're doing final assembly, not everything's on final all at once. Case in point, with the front diffuser, we had to make different size shims because what we need to do is, obviously we've got our clevis and we've got our spacer block. So I need to put a spacer on the inside, measure the spacer on the inside, match it with the actual thickness of the diffuser, and eventually get, hopefully, to the same thickness as that rear spacer. Shouldn't be too hard. So with installing the front diffuser, I should remind you that, well, the shims weren't important to getting it fitted when I did the video a few months ago. But now that we're actually trying to make sure the suspension geometry is correct, these shims are gonna prove to be critical. And we're not just shimming underneath the clevises, we're gonna also add the shims to the lower bolt holes on the splitter as well. That way, that makes sure we're not putting any weird stress on the front diffuser. So now that the floor is on for good, I get to do the aluminum taping and sealing of my fuel cell area. You can see there's just a little bit of daylight peeking by, and that's unavoidable, unfortunately. So that's why this aluminum tape comes in real handy, just to add that little bit of insurance to make sure that that is as sealed of a compartment as possible from the back end of the car. Now, racing in S.C.C.A. these days would not be complete without a Flagtronics kit. That's what I get to install here, and I found a clever little place to put it, hiding behind my Motec unit. Now we're using some, we'll call it military spec Velcro, but fortunately the unit's really light, and it's also being statically held in place by the wires itself. Now to clean up some of the wiring at the front of the car, I've decided to do something a little different. And instead of zip tying wires to the frame, I wanted to make panels that would basically provide a platform for the wires to rest on top of. It sounds a little silly, but with the inboard front suspension, I was really concerned about my wires getting in contact with moving parts. So these little trays or these little panels are gonna allow me to just have my wires travel over both the shock pots and away from all of the rocker and spring perches, helping to ensure that no way, shape, or form does wire dangle down and get in contact with anything that's moving in relationship to my car. Now I decided to make one for the front as well, just to help make sure that my toes don't grab any of the wires in the process. And I'm checking here to make sure that the shock pot's gonna work thoroughly, and fortunately it will. Now one of my final problems is, well, I've got 3 GPS beacons. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna hide 2 of them underneath the bodywork. And I know some of you already know there's a problem with this, but trust me, you'll see the solution in the next video. These 2 beacons are gonna be able to access through the center of my bodywork, and they just barely clear it. so we get to come up with a fun solution. So that's what I've got on video, edited and ready for you guys to see, but there's plenty more and plenty more on the way. So stay tuned, more episodes will be coming soon. Thank you for watching. We'll see you with the next one.